Beds, Bucks and Bricks, a memoir of my childhood. I wrote this mainly for my grandchildren, really, but just a note to explain the title. The Bucks is Buckinghamshire, the Beds, Bedfordshire. They are the two English counties in which I lived as a child. And the Bricks? My father worked for the London Brick Company Limited, LBC, all his adult life, apart from when serving in the army in World War II. Forpress, Phorpres, was the trademark of the LBC. Forpress man its logo. This was because the bricks were pressed 4 times to mould them, hence the name. It seems appropriate that my childhood was moulded in the 4 homes in which I lived until adulthood. I've thanked everybody who helped me with this, and now I'd like to read you just the beginning, the first instalment, so to speak. I'll set the scene before I get into my own actual childhood. It's strange, really, because as a child I couldn't dream that things would change so much, or that anyone would ever not know how things were then. How could any part of my own life ever become the olden days? However, it has. So, although I only learned most of this later myself, here is what some things were like for ordinary people living in post-war England. It was still a time of austerity, with rationing of nearly all goods and food, not just continuing but extended. It was 1946 that actually saw the introduction of rationing of the basic foodstuffs such as bread and potatoes. Coal was also rationed, as were petrol, gasoline, clothing and furniture. Clothing and furniture had a trademark on them, utility, a remnant of the war years. As late as December 1947, a buying permit was still needed to buy furniture, and then with priority given to those such as servicemen returning and setting up homes, and newlyweds. The total allowance of coupons for furniture was 60 per household, and certain conditions applied before anyone could apply to buy furniture. If furniture was already in the house, or there was built-in furniture, then the allowance was reduced accordingly. The only available choices were from the illustrated copy of the utility catalogue, used by all manufacturers. To save fuel, the firm chosen to supply the furniture had to be based within 15 miles of the delivery address. In some cases it was necessary to obtain a buying permit and a priority docket to purchase curtaining and floor covering. Finally, stocks were so low that immediate delivery was not always possible. The typical cost of a dining room suite, table, chairs and sideboard, 2 easy chairs and a dressing table, was £68 sterling and 38 units of coupons. Little was left from the allowance of 60 coupons for other furniture: wardrobe 12 units, bed 5 units, kitchen cabinet 8 units, and so on. Every piece of furniture had a points value. The Board of Trade Utility Furniture Office in Southport controlled all of this. Many goods were only available with coupons, even sweets, candy, which like butter were rationed to 2 ounces per person per week until 1954. Cost was also a deterrent to buying anything not necessary, when one considers that the average wage at this time was in the region of £6 sterling per week. A police constable received a salary of £273 per year, £5 5 shillings per week. For quite a number of years, running into the mid to late 1950s, purchase tax was imposed, similar to the present-day VAT or sales tax, but at the stratospheric rate of 33% on common everyday purchases, with an even higher rate of 66% on so-called luxuries, such as refrigerators, radios, known to us as wirelesses, and jewellery. Nothing was available to excess, as it was either rationed or one could not afford it. beer increased in price, and a bottle of whisky now cost £1.11, £1.55, a good quarter of an average week's pay. A lady's cardigan would cost £4.03, or £4.15 in today's money, and 6 coupons. Knitting was more than just a hobby. This was in the days when a joint was what one roasted for Sunday dinner, a fag was stuck in the mouth and smoked, grass was mowed, coke was kept in the coal shed and used as fuel, making out meant that you managed on your wages each week. To be gay was to be light-hearted and happy, and to be queer was to be simply strange or odd. In today's money, nearly everything was exceedingly cheap then, but not by the wages of the time. As I say, in 1947 the average wage was just £6 per week. Even by 1961, when I started working, £15.10, £15.50 per week, was the average weekly wage for men, no equal pay. It puts the relative cost in perspective. Dad, returning to a fairly junior job in the wages section of the London Brick Company Personnel Department at Newton Longville near Bletchley, after 6.5 years in the army, earned less than the £6 per week in 1946. Money was always tight for Mum and Dad, but they did not show that to us. By the time Dad left the Newton Longville works in 1954, he was earning £10.10 per week. He was given a pay rise of 10 shillings, bringing him up to £11, to move to Stewartby as Social and Sports Club Secretary. The rent for our first house in Whiteley Crescent, including rates, now council tax, was £1 per week. Our next house 3 years later, back in Bletchley, was not so good and about the same rent. Because the house we then moved to in Stewartby was owned and subsidised by the Brick Company, the rent there was still only just over £1 in 1954. So finances were a little bit easier, although of course other prices had gone up. When Hanson took over the London Brick Company in the 1980s, rents had gone up to £9 per week. The days of subsidised rent then became a thing of the past, as the houses were sold off. Perhaps I'd better explain a bit about the pre-decimal currency. It was generally referred to as LSD, nothing to do with the drug that came later. Strangely, the L stood for pound sterling. I think you know the pound sign. The S for shillings and the D for pence. Both the S and D were written in lower case when in actual use. This currency is what is called the duodecimal system, with 12 pence in a shilling, 20 shillings in a pound. It sounds complicated now, but we didn't think anything of it, knowing nothing else. I did write more about our old money and pre-metric weights and measures in the appendix, but I don't know if we're going to get to that. Certainly not this time. I'm afraid that I still often think in those measures, even though I can readily convert most. And of course, we still do use a lot of the old ones on a practical day-to-day level. England, and certainly our part of it, was very monocultural. I don't think I knowingly came across anyone who was not basically of white Anglo-Saxon origin, other than the Italian ice cream men who came round with their van in Bayton, until we moved to Stewartby and had a Yugoslavian neighbour. It's hard for me to imagine now, but I was quite fascinated the first time I actually saw a black person in real life. It never occurred to me to link black people, called coloured though, not black then, with gollywogs or with the rhyme 10 little nigger boys. They just looked nothing like those images, that to me were simply fictional characters like, oh I don't know, goblins or elves. In fact, it was not until several years after seeing a real live black person that I realised the caricature involved. There were so many things that we did not have that are taken completely for granted now. Some had just not been invented, and some were simply out of the reach of ordinary people. There were no personal computers, cordless or mobile phones, Game Boys, personal music players, microwaves. As for space travel, that really was the stuff of science fiction. Cars did not have seatbelts fitted as standard until 1987. There were no child and infant safety seats. Babies might be placed in a carry cot on the back seat, but an infant or young child would often be held in the arms or sit on the knee of a car passenger. Pedal cyclists certainly didn't wear helmets, and motorcycle helmets weren't compulsory. Some motorcyclists still wore leather ones, like old Star flying helmets worn with a pair of goggles. Even by the time I was 16 years old, helmets were still worn with goggles, no visors. By then, although traffic had increased hugely from my early childhood, there were still fewer than half the number of cars on the road that there are today. Odd little things we did not have included nail clippers. We just had small nail scissors. There was no mousse or hair gel, only setting lotion for the women to comb through their hair before winding it round curlers or rollers, setting it. The men used Brill cream on their hair, and all the men I knew kept their hair short. Also, some acceptable fashion customs were quite different. For example, not many people had pierced ears. That was quite a novelty. Gypsies, fairground folk, sometimes a sailor, until about the time I started secondary education. I don't remember any other kind of body piercing, and very few, other than sailors and the aforementioned, had tattoos. Vegetarianism was looked upon almost as if it was some strange cult. There were no specific vegetarian foods for sale in the shops or restaurants. The popular image was of rather peculiar sandal-wearing folk eating nut cutlets, even though we had no idea of what a nut cutlet might be. Having been born towards the end of World War II, I spent my childhood living in the Cold War. There was a continuing tense standoff between the Soviet Union, as it was then, and the West. Each side had nuclear weapons, and the threat of nuclear war could feel very real. On another sobering note, although we had no HIV or AIDS, medicine was nowhere near so far advanced as it is now. There were fewer treatments or procedures, and things were often much cruder. We didn't have keyhole surgery, and there was no chance of an organ transplant, for example, let alone gene therapy. Many drugs that we have now were also unthought of. There were fewer vaccines, which meant that even childhood illnesses could be much more serious. I was almost 10 years old when the first polio vaccine was developed. Even then it did not reach England for another couple of years. Polio was a devastating disease, especially to children, and an epidemic was very frightening. I'll be back with the next episode. Hope you enjoyed that one. When, of course, I can actually get to switch this off. Where are we? Here we go.